And one. Thanks for joining us here on 9 News Watch. I'm Chris Bianchi, and we've been closely monitoring the Alex Ewing trial over the course of the last 11 days. We've been getting closer to a potential resolution or not. Very, very interesting day in court today. We'll get to that here in just a second, but if you're unfamiliar with the case, this is the trial of Alex Ewing, who is charged in the gruesome 1984 murders of Deborah and Bruce Bennett and their 7-year-old daughter, Melissa. For continued coverage of this case, we've been checking in on a daily basis with 9 Wants to Know investigative reporter Kevin Vaughn and 9 Wants to Know director of investigative reporting Nicole Vapp. And Kevin and Nicole join us now. And Kevin, want to start things off immediately. Jury deliberates for 3.5 hours. They don't reach a verdict. We may be potentially headed to a mistrial. What's the overall gauge on the case at this point?
Well, the jury sent a note to the judge, like you said, after about 3.5 hours of deliberations, where they said that they had reached an impasse and that they did not see a way to get around that. And so the judge brought in the prosecutors and the defense attorneys into court, and they had a long discussion about what they ought to do. The defense asked for a mistrial. The judge said that it was too early to declare a mistrial. The prosecution asked that the jury be read an instruction that's pretty common in situations like this, where they essentially remind the jurors that they should go back and keep trying, and that they need to respect not only their own views but the views of everybody around them. They should work together to try to reach a unanimous verdict. And so the judge decided at that point that it was best to send them home for the night, let everybody get a good night's sleep. We should remind people this jury came in 2 weeks ago to fill out questionnaires, and then they had a whole day of jury selection last Monday, and then they have been here all day, every day since then. They got a little bit of a break yesterday afternoon, but it's been long court days every day for the last 2 weeks for them. And so I think the judge was thinking that letting them go home a little early, get a good night's sleep, and return tomorrow refreshed, and maybe continue their deliberations and maybe see if they can reach a verdict. So we'll see if that happens. If at some point, they cannot unanimously agree on something, the judge will declare take this case back to another jury at some point in the future.
You tend to think of DNA cases as kind of cut and dry, and that black and white, either you're guilty or not guilty. And I think that's why something like this is a little surprising in a case like this, is because they do have such good DNA evidence, and there was no defense put up as to why it may or may not be there. That he knew the mom, or, something like that. There was just nothing like that. And so I think people are grasping at what could they be at an impasse about. So were there any questions or any indication in their letter about what they may be disagreeing about?
Well, all through this trial, in Colorado now, jurors are allowed to question witnesses. They write out questions they want to ask. The judge reads them. If he decides they're appropriate after consulting the attorneys, he'll read them, and the person on the witness stand has to answer them. And they have asked a lot of questions, more than 50, during the testimony, which went on for 8 days, I guess, 8 days. And they asked a lot of technical questions about evidence items, about things like blood type and DNA and so forth. And so after they started deliberating, they came back with some more of those types of questions. We don't know if it's one juror that's asking them or multiple jurors, but they're very interested in the forensic evidence on this. And I think, the game plan of the defense was to acknowledge the the prosecution argued in closing arguments today and all along is damning evidence. How do you innocently explain DNA from semen around the body of a 7-year-old murder victim who was also sexually assaulted? But the defense brought out a lot of testimony, other pieces of evidence that may have been handled by people that weren't wearing gloves, pieces of evidence that got destroyed back in the 1980s during early testing, pieces of evidence that they don't know what happened to. There are a couple of slides that one person thought that evidence had been frozen and preserved, and a couple others were told that it was rotting, and then it was tested and destroyed clear back in the 80s. And so, they argued to the jury, like, you're not able to know these answers because these items don't exist for testing anymore. They hit on the fact that there's no touch DNA testing. We talked about this at great length a day or two ago, but that there was no DNA testing of a number of items that investigators believe the killer touched, up to and including a knife found in the front yard of the Bennett's home that everybody believes was used to slash Bruce Bennett's throat. The handle of that was never checked for DNA, hasn't been checked for DNA. And so the question is, did they, because it appears at this point they raised enough doubts in people's mind about the overall integrity of the evidence that got questions about the keys, which again, as we've talked all on, is this DNA.
Wow. You just wonder what is happening in that jury room. Like, how do you think after 3.5 hours there's just no hope?
Yeah, you have to interpret that at least someone on either side has dug in and said, there's nothing that's going to change my mind. I mean, obviously we're speculating here. Their deliberations are secret and so forth. We don't have a lot of insight into the makeup of the jury. Don't know a lot about their backgrounds. We sat in when they were questioned, but so you don't know what kind of life experiences people to bring to something like this. We just don't know what went on there. It's I think it was surprising to people, and there were some people in the courtroom today that I think are surprised now. Alex Ewing was accused of, never charged with, but accused of a couple of other hammer attacks in Aurora in January 1984. An attack on a young couple as they slept in the middle of the night, and an attack on a young woman who was returning home from work, attacked in her garage, seriously beaten, sexually assaulted. All of those people survived, and they were in court today. And they came to court to watch the closing arguments, and I think my reading of their reaction was that they were surprised by this. But we'll see what happens. There have been plenty of trials where juries thought they were stuck and they went back at it and they came up with a verdict. So we'll see where that goes.
Right, so they're going to be back at it at 8:30. One thing I think is important to point out is the jury does not know some of the things that we've talked about in the podcast, which include that he was in prison for a similar type attack in Nevada and in Arizona, but more specifically in Nevada. And he's, in that case, this is the year he's up for parole.
Yeah, I just was chatting with a couple defense attorneys that came and asked if there was a verdict, and they followed this case, but they have their own cases, and so I told them what had gone on, and they were really surprised, and they said, "Well, do you get in the mindset of a juror?" And I said, "Well, it's really hard because I know so much more than they know. We've gone to Arizona and we've gone to Nevada and talked to the victims in those cases, and we know all about Alex Ewing's past, things the jury is not allowed to know at this point. And so it's hard to think like a juror, but it was clear to me early on, the defense, from the very first couple of witnesses was going at this question of how the evidence was handled, and questions from the jurors were on those topics. And so it was clear to me that they were successful in getting jurors to think about the handling of the evidence. And, the district attorney made the point today, for example, that some of this DNA was identified during testing in 1999. That's 22 years ago. And the defense brought up a picture of what this piece of evidence looks like now. And it's it might be in a packaging that's got a rip in it or a hole in it or something, or there might be a question about how well it's sealed up. And the point was, what it looks like today is not emblematic of what it looked like 22 years ago when this testing was done. But, obviously the defense scored points, got jurors thinking about these things, asking questions about them, and they were asking questions about them this afternoon when they were sending questions out to the judge.
Hmm. Well, it'll be interesting. I'll be on the edge of my seat tomorrow, waiting to hear from you. If you want to follow this case, when there is a verdict or a mistrial or whatever happens tomorrow, Kevin will tweet it. It'll be on the networks of Nine News. As soon as we can, we'll jump back on this, no matter what time of day it is. We'll just jump back into a discussion like this because I know we're all on the edge of our seats trying to figure out what's going to happen.
And by the way, Nicole and Kevin, to
Exactly.
that point, the number that you can text to get updates on this case, it is 303-871-1491, and you text the word BLAME, BLAME, to that phone number, and you'll get those continued updates, and also follow Kevin on Twitter for those continued updates as well. So, obviously, here we're at the crux of this case. May find out something tomorrow. We'll see what happens, but as you said, Nicole, should be an interesting day. And by the way, also, reminder, Nicole, I know you mentioned this during the during our taping here, that we got an 11-part podcast, Blame the Fear All These Years, that is available on Apple Podcasts as well as on 9news.com/blame. But more importantly, Kevin and Nicole, I know very busy day today. We'll see what happens tomorrow. We'll check back in tomorrow. But for now, have a great rest of your day, and we'll see you again here tomorrow.
Thanks, Chris.